The electronic chime above the door sounded once, a flat, institutional beep, and then dissolved into the ambient noise of Webb's tactical supply and range, the way a stone disappears into deep water. 16:30 hours on a Friday afternoon, and the place was running at its familiar low roar. The fluorescent bars overhead cast everything in that particular shade of white light that made gunmetal look clean and human skin look tired. 8 shooting lanes stretched behind a thick pane of ballistic glass at the back. 3 of them were occupied. The rhythmic percussion of the ranges, muffled, deliberate, moved through the floor in a way you felt more than heard. Hazel Cross stepped through the door and stopped for exactly 1.5 seconds. Her eyes moved across the room in a single sweep, left to right, low to high, exits noted, bodies counted, 15 people, 4 employees, 2 women near the accessories wall. A man in his 60s seated in a worn chair by the window, reading something. A young soldier in civilian clothes standing at the far counter, turning over a magazine holder in his hands. The sweep took no time at all. It looked like nothing. She was already walking again before anyone noticed she had paused. The uniform she wore was medical, scrubs in the particular blue of Harlow Creek Regional's ICU ward, the kind of washed-out teal that becomes a second skin after enough 12-hour shifts. Her sneakers were a pair of green Crocs with the heels worn down on the inside edge. Her hair was pulled into a knot at the back of her head, with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste time on it. A canvas tote bag hung from her left shoulder. Inside, a wallet, a key fob, and a small folded note in her own handwriting. Federal ST 9mm, 124 grain. Lane 4 if available. She was 34 years old, and looked 34 in the way that people who have spent significant time outdoors in difficult weather look their age. Not worn exactly, but fully present in it. There were no rings on her fingers. The badge clipped to her bag identified her as Hazel Cross, RN, Harlow Creek Regional ICU, with the kind of laminated flatness that official credentials always have. Her posture was quiet and entirely upright, the kind that requires no active maintenance. She didn't look around for help. She walked straight toward the main counter. 3 men were occupying it. Brick Harmon was the kind of man who took up space the way a parked truck takes up a lane. Not aggressively, but completely, and with the unspoken assumption that everyone else would simply root around him. He stood with one forearm resting on the glass display case, his weight settled into it, inspecting nothing in particular in the case below. His sleeves were pushed up to the elbows, revealing forearms covered in old ink tattoos that had spread and blurred with age. Beside him, 2 men in similar build and similar disposition, Flynn Maddox and a man with a close-cropped beard who hadn't introduced himself to anyone that afternoon, were involved in a conversation about a Desert Eagle displayed on a velvet mount inside the case. It was the kind of conversation that wasn't really about the gun. Crystal Vance stood slightly apart from the group, the way a satellite maintains orbit. Her hair was the precise shade of blonde that requires maintenance, falling straight past her shoulders. She wore a white linen blazer over dark jeans and held an equipment catalog loosely in one hand, the way you hold a magazine at a doctor's office, not reading it, just having it. The sunglasses pushed up on her head were designer. Her boyfriend was Captain Cyrus Vance, currently on base at Fort Caldwell, and this social geography, proximity to rank, gave Crystal a specific kind of fluency in rooms like this one. She knew which doors opened and which ones didn't, and she had an instinct, refined over years of garrison life, for reading the hierarchy of any space she entered. She had read Hazel Cross in approximately 4 seconds and placed her without effort. Garnet Holt was behind the counter, early 20s, new enough to still be performing competence rather than possessing it. He had the look of someone who had decided that this job was temporary but was already developing the habits of the place. The half-tilt of authority that comes from standing between the customer and what the customer wants. Hazel stopped at the counter and waited. Garnet was explaining something about the Desert Eagle's action to Brick. He didn't look up. She waited. Brick glanced sideways, the way you notice a dog has come to sit near your chair. He looked at the scrubs. He looked at the Crocs. He looked at the canvas bag. He took a breath. The kind that comes before performance. Hey. His voice carried easily in the space between conversations. He wasn't speaking quietly. Did the hospital move? I thought the ER was on the other side of town. Flynn turned. The bearded man turned. Crystal raised her eyes from the catalog. Hazel looked at Garnet and said, Federal HST 9mm, 124 grain, 2 boxes. It was the precise, unhurried delivery of someone reading from an internal list. No preamble, no softening. Garnet blinked. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Brick's voice had acquired a slightly different quality, not louder, but more deliberate. "This isn't the place for whatever you think it is. No toys here, sweetheart. No band-aids either." The two men with him made the sounds that serve as laughter in those situations. Crystal's eyes moved to Hazel with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary from a very comfortable couch. Hazel did not look at Brick. She kept her eyes on Garnet and said nothing further. She had placed her order. She was waiting to see if it would be filled. Garnet's gaze shifted to Brick. Something passed between them in the way of young men, an unspoken question about whose authority this moment required. Brick straightened slightly. That was the answer. "I said," Brick repeated, now with the exaggerated patience of a man who has decided to make a lesson of something. "This isn't a toy shop." He paused for effect. "And it's definitely not your kind of place." In the chair by the window, Silas Grant looked up from his reading. He was somewhere north of 70, with the kind of face that had been rearranged by weather and time into something close to carved stone. He watched without moving. Near the accessories wall, a young woman, Daisy Monroe, no older than 23, holding a small item she'd been examining for the past several minutes, turned her head toward the counter. She had the particular alertness of someone who has grown up in and around military communities, who can identify certain kinds of tension before they become visible. Ivy Collins, standing near the entrance where she had retreated 3 minutes earlier, pressed her fingers against the strap of her own bag and watched her colleague's back. She had known Hazel Cross for 2 years. They had eaten lunch together in the break room of the ICU ward more times than she could count. She had watched Hazel manage a crash cart with 4 other nurses yelling at once. She had seen Hazel hold a patient's hand for 40 minutes at 2 in the morning when there was no one else and nothing else left to do. She had never once seen Hazel look uncertain. But what was happening now was something different. Not uncertainty from Hazel's side, but the creeping uncomfortable awareness that Ivy had been looking at someone for 2 years the way you look at a room you think you know, without ever opening any of the doors. "Maybe she should come back with her husband," Crystal said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone offering a reasonable suggestion. She flipped a page in the catalog she wasn't reading. "Might be easier." "I work better alone," Hazel said. It was the first thing she had said that wasn't an order request. She said it in the way you state a fact about weather. No inflection, no invitation. Then she looked at Garnet again. "The HST when you're ready." Before we go any further, if you're new here, this channel tells the stories of the people who served in silence. The ones you walk past every day without knowing what they carry. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because this story is just getting started. And trust me, you won't want to walk away in the next 10 minutes. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever completely misjudged someone? Tell me below. Deceit. Garnet cleared his throat and made a show of consulting something behind the counter. What was it again? "Federal HST," she said, with the identical rhythm as before. 9mm, 124 grain, 2 boxes. "We might be low on that load," Garnet said. Hazel's eyes moved, for the first time, to the shelving unit behind him. 3 rows of ammunition in clear plastic packaging. Federal HST 9mm, 124 grain, stacked 3 high on the second shelf to the left. She looked at the boxes. She looked at Garnet. Garnet held her gaze for 2 seconds, then looked down at the counter. Flynn Maddox had drifted closer. He had the lean confidence of someone who has been told he is knowledgeable in a specific domain and has decided this extends outward into a general principle. He reached past Crystal to pick up a Glock 17 that had been sitting on a demonstration pad near the register, a non-firing display model, and held it with the easy familiarity of a man who holds guns in front of women to see what they do. "You ever actually fire one of these?" he asked. He wasn't quite looking at Hazel when he said it. He was looking at the gun. Hazel looked at the Glock, then she looked at Flynn. "Glock 17 Generation 5, she said. 17 plus 1 capacity, 3-pound trigger pull, modular optics system cut on the slide." She said this the way you recite something you have repeated until it is no longer information but reflex. Front serrations added in the Gen 5 revision, flared mag well. A silence fell over that particular 4-foot radius. Flynn blinked. He recovered quickly, the way men who have been wrong in public for the first time often recover, with a small, dismissive smile. "Okay, Good memory. You carry a spec sheet in that bag? No, Hazel said. Crystal set the catalog down. Her eyes had acquired a sharpness that hadn't been there a moment ago. Not hostile exactly, but recalculated. Where did you pick all that up? She asked. Her tone suggested there was a correct and incorrect answer. Reading, Hazel said. Silas Grant, from his chair by the window, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. At the back of the store, separated from the retail floor by a long wooden counter and a half wall of pegboard loaded with holsters, Otis Webb came through from the back room. He was 61 years old and built like someone who had once been assembled for functional purposes and never reassembled for anything else. His head was shaved close. His face had the quality of a topographic map, ridged, layered, shaped by things that had happened at specific coordinates. He was carrying a 1911 wrapped in a cleaning cloth, working it with a patch in the mechanical, unhurried way of a man who has cleaned several thousand weapons in his life and expects to clean several thousand more. He took in the room in the same way Hazel had taken it in when she walked through the door, efficiently and without appearing to. He went back to cleaning the 1911. Brick had been quiet for the past minute, in the way of a man recalibrating an approach. He recalibrated now. He stepped away from the counter and positioned himself, not blocking, not quite, but occupying the space between Hazel and the door to the lanes in a way that required navigation. So, he said, making it conversational, you actually want to shoot something. That's what the lanes are for, Hazel said. All the lanes are booked. He said it easily, as a statement of fact. Hazel turned her head toward the board mounted on the wall, the whiteboard where Garnet had written the day's lane reservations in blue marker. Lanes 1 through 3, occupied. Lane 4, Crystal/C, Vance, 1700 hours. Lanes 5 through 8, blank. She looked at lanes 6 and 7, which were blank. She looked at Brick. Brick didn't look at the board. He was looking at her. 6 and 7 are down for maintenance, Garnet said from behind the counter. The words came out rehearsed, and then immediately sounded rehearsed. He added nothing to them. Hazel said nothing. She looked at Garnet the same way she had looked at the shelf behind him when he claimed they were out of the HST. The look communicated, without any editorializing, that she understood exactly what was happening. Flynn moved closer again. He had put the Glock back on the demonstration pad and was now standing beside Brick with the posture of a man who has signed up for something without having read the terms. Look, he said, his voice dropping into what he believed was a reasonable register. I could show you some basics, if that's what you're actually here for. Proper stance, how to manage the recoil. Basic stuff. He opened one hand, palm up, the way men offer help to women they have decided need it. Wouldn't cost much. Hazel reached into her canvas bag, pulled out the folded note, set it on the counter next to the ammunition request as if filing a second document. Then she reached into the bag again, passed her wallet, and placed a small orange foam earplug case on the counter, standard range kit. She opened it, took out the earplugs, and began rolling the first one between her thumb and index finger, with the practiced automatic motion of someone who has done this hundreds of times without thinking about it. The foam compressed into a tight cylinder, held, waiting to expand. She put it in her left ear, then the right. She looked at Garnet. Flynn's explanation about basic stance training trailed off into the ambient noise. In the chair by the window, Silas Grant had stopped reading entirely. He was looking at Hazel's hands. Near the accessories wall, Daisy Monroe had set down the item she'd been examining. She was just watching now. Logan Pruitt, 22, a local university student who had come in to buy a cleaning kit for a rifle he had inherited from his grandfather, had his phone out and angled at a 45-degree angle that he likely thought was less obvious than it was. His thumb hovered over the record icon. The bearded man beside Brick had started paying attention to something near the door, in the way of someone who has decided they are no longer comfortable being part of whatever this is becoming. It was Caleb Reed who drew Hazel's attention next, though he did not do anything dramatic to get it. He had been at the far counter this entire time, turning the magazine holder over in his hands without buying it, and he moved now, not toward the confrontation, but to the accessories wall, where he began examining a row of cleaning kits with the focus of a man who wants a reason to stay in a room without appearing to have one. He was Sergeant First Class, active duty, Fort Caldwell. He had the build and bearing of someone who had spent a significant portion of his adult life in body armor. He looked at Hazel's hands the same way Silas had, briefly, carefully, and without her noticing. Crystal had retrieved her phone. She was typing something, with the practiced concentration of someone who has learned to seem busy precisely when they want to watch. Brick was running out of angles. He could feel it. The slight shift in the room's attention. The way some of the casual confidence had drained out of the moment while he wasn't looking. He made one more attempt. The way a man throws a Hail Mary, not because he believes in it, but because standing still would be worse. "You know what?" he said. "I'm going to make this easy. Prove to me you know what you're doing, and Garnet will get you your ammo, set you up with a lane. The whole thing." He gestured toward the demonstration Glock on the pad. "Tell me something about that gun that I don't already know." Hazel turned her eyes from the lane board to the Glock 17 on the pad. "The Gen 5 removed the finger grooves from the frame," she said, "broadened the grip to accommodate more hand sizes. The barrel is Glock's marksman barrel, improved polygonal rifling, tighter tolerances than the Gen 4. Sight radius is 6.2 inches. The trigger uses their updated flat-face design, which some shooters find reduces muzzle dip on the break." She paused. "The mag release is reversible now for left-hand draws." She said this the way you describe a street you have driven down 1,000 times. Not recalling it, just reporting it. Flynn had gone still. The bearded man had turned back from the door. Crystal's phone was no longer being typed on. Brick stared at her for a moment. His expression had not changed precisely, but something behind it had shifted. A recalculation happening in real time. He looked at Flynn. Flynn gave him nothing useful in return. "YouTube," Crystal said at last, and the word came out flatter than she'd intended. "They explain everything on YouTube now." "Sure," Hazel said. From the window chair, Silas Grant made the not-quite laugh sound again, slightly more audible this time. "Seg." It was the HK-45 that changed the temperature of the room. Flynn had retrieved it from the unlocked display case on the wall, a tactical variant, matte black, the demonstration model that customers were allowed to handle under supervision. He set it on the counter with a particular kind of authority, the kind borrowed from the object itself. "All right," he said. "You know spec sheets. Fine." He pushed the empty pistol toward her. "Tell me the trigger reset on this one." The question was a test designed to be failed. Trigger reset on a handgun is not the kind of number that appears in most general access resources. It requires handling, repetition, the kind of tactile knowledge that comes from trigger time alone. Hazel looked at the HK-45 for 2 seconds. "Approximately 3/16 of an inch," she said. "Short reset, better than the USP platform at close range. Cleaner break, less over travel." Flynn's mouth opened, then closed. Crystal looked at him. He looked at Crystal. Neither of them had anything for the other in that moment. Garnet had taken one step backward from the counter without appearing to realize he'd done it. Otis Webb, at the back, had stopped cleaning the 1911. He was holding it loosely, the cloth draped over his hand, and he was watching the far end of the counter with an expression that wasn't readable from across the room, but had the quality of something settling, a piece of information landing in a place that had been prepared to receive it. Caleb Reed had put the cleaning kit back on the shelf. He had moved 3 feet closer to the main counter. Crystal recovered first, or attempted to. She set her phone down and produced a smile, the kind that is assembled rather than arrived at. "Okay, I'll admit, that's impressive for someone who read it somewhere." She gave a small, gracious shrug. "But knowing numbers and actually shooting are 2 different things, right?" "Yes," Hazel agreed. The agreement seemed to unsettle Crystal more than an argument would have. Brick tried a different approach. He leaned back against the counter, crossed his arms, and looked at Hazel with the studied casualness of a man trying to reassert the terms of something. "So, all this knowledge, why are you here in Scrubs buying ammo at 16:30 on a Friday? Shouldn't you be—" He gestured vaguely at her uniform. "Somewhere else?" "It's my day off," Hazel said. "You work at the regional hospital," Crystal said. And it wasn't a question. It was a categorization. The badge clipped to Hazel's bag, which identified her as Hazel Cross, RN, Harlow Creek Regional ICU, had been visible this entire time. Crystal filed this, and the filing was audible. "That's nice work." "That's nice work" carried considerable weight. "It is," Hazel said. "Long way from a shooting range, though." "It's 2 miles. Daisy Monroe made a sound near the accessories wall, something that was not quite a laugh, but wasn't not one either. She covered it with a small cough and went back to looking at nothing in particular. Flynn had been quiet for longer than he was comfortable with. He moved toward the demonstration table along the side wall, where several firearms were laid out for handling. a standard practice at tactical ranges, part of the sales floor, and stopped at the HK-45. He looked at it, and then he looked at Hazel, and something in his expression said that he had arrived at a decision. Here, he set the handgun on the empty section of counter nearest to Hazel. If you actually know what you're talking about, take it apart. Otis Webb set the 1911 down. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply set it on the cloth and kept his hands still. You're halfway through, and I need you to stay, because what's about to happen in the next 5 minutes is the reason this story exists. If Hazel's silence is getting under your skin the way it's getting under theirs, share this video with one person who needs to hear it. And while you're at it, what do you think is on that tattoo? Drop your guess in the comments. Let's see who gets it right. The room had achieved a specific quality of stillness. Logan Pruitt's thumb had pressed record. Silas Grant had folded his reading material and set it on the seat beside him. Caleb Reed was no longer pretending to look at anything except what was in front of him. Ivy Collins, from the entrance, had taken 3 steps forward without realizing it. Hazel looked at the HK-45 on the counter. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took her to remove the earplugs, left, then right, and set them on the counter beside the gun. She took off her canvas bag and placed it carefully on the floor by the base of the display case. She picked up the handgun. The change was immediate and impossible to name precisely. Nothing dramatic happened. She didn't perform. She simply picked up the gun, and in the act of picking it up, everything that had been uncertain about her became, for anyone who knew what to look for, entirely resolved. Her index finger went straight, parallel to the frame, before the gun was fully in her hand. Her thumb found the safety in the same motion that established her grip, not sequential, simultaneous, the way hands work when they have been taught something, until the teaching disappears and only the doing remains. She checked the chamber with a rearward press of the slide, a single fluid motion, eyes moving to the ejection port, then back, before her hands had completed the full grip. The magazine was already out. It had taken no visible effort. She set the empty magazine on the counter, oriented the gun muzzle up, and began the field strip. The recoil spring and guide rod came free first, placed on the counter in the sequence that denotes someone who has been trained to lay parts down in the order they came apart. Not because they'll forget, but because the habit exists for conditions where forgetting is dangerous. The barrel followed, the slide assembly, the frame, 11 seconds. She hadn't looked at her hands once. The parts were arrayed on the counter in a straight line, equidistant, parallel to the edge. She placed her own hands flat on the counter on either side of them and waited. Nobody said anything. What had just happened was not easily categorized. It was not a performance. There had been no speed for show, no drama in the movement, just economy. The kind of economy that develops when the repetition of a task has been compressed by necessity until it is no longer a sequence of actions, but a single action. Brick had expected, if he was honest with himself, something clumsy, or something practiced but still recognizable as practiced, the careful execution of a learned skill, the slight visible hesitation between steps. He had not expected 11 seconds of a woman who had clearly done this with her eyes closed in the dark, and in worse conditions than a well-lit gun store counter. He looked at her hands again, flat on the counter, relaxed, waiting. The sound from the lanes at the back, the muffled percussion of people shooting, seemed in that moment to be coming from a very different kind of place than the one they were all standing in. Logan Pruitt's phone was still recording. His hand had adjusted its angle downward, toward the counter, toward the line of parts. It was Caleb Reed who broke the silence. Not with the first words, but with the first movement. He had been standing still for a long time. He took 2 steps toward the counter. He looked at the parts. He looked at Hazel's hands, the right one specifically. The scar on the back of her right hand was small, maybe 2 centimeters, with the kind of smooth, pale finish that comes from a wound that received proper treatment under conditions that did not allow for cosmetic considerations. It ran at a slight diagonal from the second knuckle toward the wrist. It was not the kind of scar you got working in a hospital. He had seen enough of them to know that. He looked at her left hand. There was a corresponding scar on the outside edge of the left palm, near the heel of the hand, older and more faded. He looked at the way she had laid the parts on the counter, in sequence, in order, muzzle forward, each piece slightly separated from the next. That wasn't how civilians disassembled a weapon to show off. That was how you laid parts down when you were going to need to reassemble them fast, in low light, with gloves on. Caleb Reed put the information away and said nothing, but he did not go back to looking at the cleaning kits. Crystal Vance had not spoken in 4 minutes, which was, by the informal accounting of everyone in the room, a long time. Flynn Maddox was looking at the disassembled handgun on the counter with the expression of a man reviewing an exam. He was confident he had passed until he saw the answer key. Brick Harmon had uncrossed his arms. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides. Not aggressive, not retreating, just standing, which was a different posture than he had been using for the previous 40 minutes. Garnet was not looking at the counter. He was looking at the space above the counter, which is the direction people look when they are deciding something. Otis Webb had moved, not far, 3 steps, bringing him to the end of the long back counter, but he was facing the room now, rather than the back wall. Daisy Monroe had both hands clasped in front of her. Hazel picked up the barrel and reinserted it into the slide, the spring, the guide rod, the frame-to-slide reattachment, the magazine, seated with a clean snap. She ran the slide back and forward once, settling the return, and set the HK-45 back on the counter, muzzle pointed downrange, exactly where Flynn had placed it. She looked at Flynn. "Cleaned and function checked," she said. "You'll want to run a few dry cycles before you put it back in the case. The recoil spring shows some use." Flynn stared at the gun for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." It was not the response he had prepared, but it was the only one available. Silas Grant, in the window chair, looked at the gun and looked at Hazel and made his decision. He rose, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man managing a body that has been used hard, and walked to the counter. He stood beside Hazel, 1 space over, and looked at Garnet. "She asked for ammo 20 minutes ago," Silas said. Garnet opened his mouth. "The HST," Silas said. 3 boxes. Put it on my tab." Garnet looked at the shelf behind him. He looked at Brick. Brick was looking at the disassembled and reassembled gun that still sat on the counter between them, and he was not looking at Garnet. 2 boxes, Hazel said quietly, "and I'll pay for them myself." There was a pause. Then Garnet turned to the shelf, reached for the Federal HST 9mm, 124 grain, and set 2 boxes on the counter. The transaction took 45 seconds. Hazel put her earplugs back in, picked up her canvas bag, and turned toward the lanes. She had taken 4 steps when Brick moved. He didn't block her, not exactly. He stepped from his position at the counter to a point along the natural path to lane 6, which put him squarely between her and the door to the range. It was a movement with deniability built into it, the kind that could be called coincidence if it needed to be. "You know," he said, and his voice had changed again, quieter now, with something in it that was close to serious for the first time. "You've been very patient. I'll give you that." He looked at her with an expression that was a tempting sincerity. "But I've been coming here for 3 years. I know this range, and I know Otis runs a certain kind of operation." He let the implication settle. "So, how about we make this interesting? You and me, 25 yards. Best group takes the lane for the rest of the evening." Otis Webb, from the back counter, spoke. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "Lane 6 is open," he said. Brick turned toward the back counter. He had not fully heard Otis speak in the hour he had been in the store. The owner had been background, peripheral, part of the furniture in the way that men who own things sometimes are when other men are busy establishing themselves in the foreground. Now, standing at the end of the back counter, the cleaning cloth still over one hand, Otis looked at Brick with an expression that communicated the entirety of what needed to be communicated, without ornament. "Lane 6, Otis 6, Otis said again. "It's available." Garnet looked at the whiteboard. He uncapped a blue marker. He wrote Hazel's name next to lane 6. Brick held Otis's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he stepped aside. Hazel walked through. She did not look at Brick as she passed. She did not look at Flynn or Crystal or Garnet. She looked straight ahead, at the glass door to the range bays, at the ballistic curtain beyond it, at lane 6, which was clean and lit and waiting. She pushed through the door. The sound from the range came to meet her, familiar, contained, purposeful. Behind her, through the glass, 15 people stood in varying arrangements of recalibration. Logan Pruitt's phone was still recording. Caleb Reed had moved to a position near the back counter. He and Otis Webb were not looking at each other, but they were standing 2 feet apart, which was something. Silas Grant had returned to his chair. He had not reopened his reading material. And Noah Holt, 16 years old, Garnett's younger sister, who had come to the store that afternoon for her first session on the range, was standing near the entrance door with her scheduled instructor, having arrived during the disassembly, having watched every second of it, and was now looking through the glass at the woman settling into lane 6 with an expression she would not be able to describe later when people asked her what it had felt like to be in that room. She had come here to learn how to shoot. She was already learning something else. Lane 6 was exactly what Hazel needed it to be. Clean. Enclosed. 25 yards of controlled distance between her and a standard B-27 silhouette target mounted on a motorized carrier. The fluorescent overheads in the range bay were brighter than the retail floor, and the smell was different, sharper, with the mineral bite of spent propellant baked into the concrete over years of use. She hung her canvas bag on the hook at the back of the lane, racked the target carrier out to 10 yards to start, and began loading the first magazine from the HST box with the methodical patience of someone who finds the ritual useful rather than tedious. Through the ballistic glass partition between lanes, a man in his 40s was working through a string of fire on a steel popper target. His technique was functional but loose, trigger finger creeping early, support hand not fully locked. She noted it without judgment. People came to ranges for all kinds of reasons. Not everyone came to improve. She came because she needed to maintain something that would otherwise dull in the same way a language dulls when you stop speaking it. 4 years of civilian life had not changed the essential architecture of who she was. It had only added a layer over the top of it. The scrubs, the badge, the 12-hour shifts in the ICU, the professional competence she had rebuilt from a different direction. The knowledge of how to keep people alive had never left her. It had simply changed its address. She loaded 17 rounds, seated the magazine, chambered the first, and fired a 5-round group at 10 yards to settle the grip. The group measured just under 1 inch. She moved the target to 25 yards and kept shooting. Behind the glass, she could see, if she turned slightly, the retail floor. She did not turn. What was happening on the retail floor in her absence was a particular kind of silence, the sort that follows a significant event when no one present has yet fully processed what the event means. Brick Harmon was standing where he had been standing when Hazel walked past him. He had not moved far. His arms were no longer crossed. He was looking at the glass door to the range bays as though it had just delivered him information he hadn't ordered. Flynn Maddox had picked up the HK-45 from the counter, the one Hazel had stripped and reassembled, and was holding it in a way that suggested he wasn't sure why he'd picked it up. His fingers found the trigger guard without looking. He set it back down. Crystal Vance was looking at her phone, not typing on it, looking at it, the way people look at phones when they want to appear occupied, but are actually reviewing something that just happened, and finding, upon review, that they have less to say about it than they expected. Garnett was behind the counter, pretending to organize a shelf that did not require organization. The bearded man who had been part of Brick's group had walked to the accessories wall and appeared to be genuinely interested in a holster. His participation in the afternoon had quietly concluded. Daisy Monroe sat down on the bench along the wall. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the glass partition through which, at the right angle, you could just see the back of Hazel's head in lane 6. Logan Pruitt had lowered his phone but had not stopped recording. Silas Grant had resumed his seat by the window. He had not reopened his reading material. Ethan Koss, Otis's senior employee, a quiet man of 50 with the look of someone who had spent enough years here to become part of the inventory, came out from the back room carrying a parts order and stopped when he felt the texture of the air. He looked at Otis. Otis tilted his head slightly toward the range bays. Ethan put the parts order on a shelf and went back to what he had been doing without asking any questions. Noah Holt was still standing near the entrance. Her range instructor, a retired MP named Gerald who taught Friday afternoon beginners, was beside her, reviewing the safety briefing on his clipboard. Gerald had not seen what happened because he had arrived after the disassembly. Noah had, and she was still inside it, still replaying the 11 seconds, still trying to locate the appropriate frame of reference for what she had seen a woman in hospital scrubs do with a pistol on a gun store counter. Caleb Reed was now standing at the back counter, not adjacent to Otis. Directly at it, both forearms resting on the surface, the way two people stand at a bar when they are about to have a real conversation. Otis Webb set down his cleaning cloth. He looked at Caleb. "You see the hands," Caleb said. It was not a question. I saw them, Otis said. The strip sequence. Parts laid out in field order. Caleb kept his voice even. That's not range training. That's not even advanced civilian. That's... I know what it is, Otis said. A pause settled between them, comfortable in the way of men who have shared certain kinds of experiences and do not require complete sentences to communicate about them. You know her? Caleb asked. Never seen her before today. Otis looked toward the range bays. But I know that. He meant the way she had handled the gun, the way she had handled the room, the way she had handled Brick's escalation with the particular kind of patience that is not restraint, not suppression, but genuine disinterest in the conflict as a conflict. The patience of someone for whom this level of provocation does not register on the scale they use for measuring provocation. Caleb nodded once, slowly. He pulled out his phone and opened a browser. In lane 6, Hazel was running her second magazine. She had moved the target to 25 yards and was working a rhythm. 2 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause. Not for accuracy practice, but for trigger discipline. The pause between pairs was exactly long enough to feel the reset, to locate it without looking, to make the relationship between the shot and the next shot a matter of feel rather than thought. The SIG P226 in her hands was not a range gun. It was not new. The grip panels had worn to a matte finish from use, and the frame showed the kind of micro-scratches that accumulate when a weapon is drawn and holstered repeatedly in the dark, in the field, against things that weren't holsters. The front sight had been replaced at some point with a tritium insert that was slightly yellowed with age. The magazine floor plates had been swapped for extended versions, not for capacity, but for the 3-finger reload under stress that gloved hands require. It was a working tool, the kind of working tool that stays with a person, because it has been modified over time to fit that specific person's hands, that specific person's training, that specific person's requirements in conditions that had very specific names and very specific dates. She ran the magazine to empty, locked the slide back, removed it, set it on the shelf at the back of the lane. She looked at the target. The group at 25 yards measured under 1 inch. All 17 in the same place, not scattered, not even close to scattered. She brought the target carrier in, removed the target, folded it into the canvas bag. She loaded the second magazine. She was not aware that the retail floor had gone partially quiet on her account. She was not tracking the conversation at the back counter. She was not thinking about Brick Harmon or Flynn Maddox or Crystal Vance or the whiteboard or the shelf with the HST boxes. She was here, in lane 6. With 25 yards and a target and 17 rounds in a magazine she had loaded herself. From ammunition she had finally been allowed to purchase after the better part of an hour. She raised the P226. She fired. Genost. It was Brick who broke the stalemate on the retail floor, and he did it in the way that people who have been publicly wrong about something sometimes do, by choosing a different target. He had been standing for several minutes in a posture of uncertain recalibration, and during that time something had been working behind his eyes. Not remorse, not yet, possibly not ever, but the particular restlessness of a man who cannot accept that a situation has closed without him having had the last word in it. He had been mocked by the outcome, which is different from being mocked by a person, and is harder to address because you cannot confront the outcome the way you can confront a person. So, he looked for a person. He found Caleb Reed at the back counter. "Hey," he said, moving that direction. "Sergeant." He said the word with the particular inflection that civilian men use to address soldiers when they want to remind both parties that the civilian is not bound by rank. "You were watching all that. You're active duty, right? You think that was normal? Some nurse walks in here and does all that?" Caleb turned from the counter. He looked at Brick for a moment. "I wasn't watching that," Caleb said. "I was watching her." Brick blinked. "That's what I..." "Those are different things," Caleb said. He turned back to his phone. Brick opened his mouth again, and Otis Webb said, without raising his voice or changing its tone, "Brick, 1 word. The way you say 1 word to a dog that has been patient with you and is running out of patience." Brick looked at Otis. Otis looked at Brick. Something in that exchange was sufficient. Brick turned away from the back counter and went to stand near Flynn, who was now sitting on the bench nearest the accessories wall with his elbows on his knees, not looking at anything in particular. Crystal Vance was still on her phone, but she had changed her posture, leaning slightly forward now, one shoulder toward the range bays. She was no longer performing casualness. She was waiting for something, though she could not have said specifically what. It came 12 minutes after Hazel had walked into the range bays. She came out through the front glass door with the canvas bag over her shoulder and the empty ammunition boxes in her hand, which she placed in the recycling bin near the range entrance. She pulled her earplugs and placed them back in the foam case. She picked up the canvas bag. She turned toward the exit. She had covered about 6 feet of retail floor when Brick Harmon made his last move. He was not a man who was capable of letting things end on someone else's terms. This is the essential fact about men like Brick. Not that they are malicious, exactly, but that they have organized their understanding of any room around the principle that they are the person who gets to decide when it's over. This was a room that had stopped being organized around that principle, and the reorganization had happened without his permission, and he was not done with it. He took 3 steps from his position near the accessories wall, not to block her. He had been told, through Otis's single word, that blocking was no longer available to him. He positioned himself to her right, slightly ahead, in a way that made the exit slightly awkward to reach without acknowledging him. "Hold on," he said. "Just hold on. 1 second." Hazel stopped. "You're pretty good," he said. The compliment was clearly costing him something. "I'll give you that, but here's what I'm thinking." He reached toward the counter where the HK-45 was still sitting, intending to pick it up, to re-establish some authority in the exchange through the familiar mechanism of handling something. His hand closed on Hazel's left forearm instead. It was not intentional. He had miscalculated the distance between her arm and the counter in the same way that people in motion sometimes misjudge the geometry of a space, and his hand closed on fabric and wrist rather than pistol frame. He pulled slightly, a reflexive correction, trying to reposition past her arm to the gun. The sleeve of her scrub's top pulled with his grip. The fabric rode up. 4 inches above her left wrist, on the inner forearm, a tattoo was exposed that had been concealed by the long medical sleeve all afternoon. It was not decorative. The ink was old, not faded to illegibility, but settled into the skin with the permanence of something put there when the wearer was young and did not expect to ever want to remove it. 3 elements. In the center, Roman numerals, 18, rendered in a clean block serif. Above them, the wings. Not angel wings, not decorative wings. These were the stylized jump wings of airborne units. The airborne tab iconography rendered in solid black, spread and angular. Below the numerals, in smaller text set in capital letters, a line that was not a motto so much as a statement of purpose. Ranger Medic de Oppresso Liber. Brick's hand released her arm, not because he made a decision to release it, because his hand simply opened. 3 seconds of silence. In the entry, Noah Holt put her hand over her mouth. Daisy Monroe rose from her bench without deciding to rise. Logan Pruitt's phone, which had been on record the entire time, swung toward the forearm and the tattoo without its owner being aware of the movement. Ivy Collins had stepped through the glass entry door from her position near the entrance the moment she saw Brick's hand close on Hazel's arm. She stopped 2 feet inside the store, still holding her bag. She had not made a sound, and she did not make one now. She stood and looked at the forearm and at the tattoo, and then she looked at the profile of her colleague, the woman who made tea in the ICU break room and always offered the second cup to whoever came in behind her, who kept a folded blanket in her car for patients waiting for discharge in cold weather, who had never once, in 2 years of shared lunches and shared shifts and shared 4 a.m. silences over the nursing station, mentioned any of this. Silas Grant rose from his chair. He did not do it slowly this time. He rose the way old soldiers rise when something that matters is happening, with the residual speed of a body that was once trained to respond and never fully forgot how. He stood with his back straight and his hands at his sides, and he looked at the tattoo on Hazel Cross's forearm, and he did not look away. Caleb Reed set his phone down on Otis's counter. He took off his cap. He held it against his chest. Otis Webb came out from behind the counter. He had been behind it since before Hazel walked in. It was his counter, his store, his space, the place from which he managed every interaction in the building. In the 3 years that Brick had been a regular customer, he had never seen Otis come out from behind that counter in the middle of a retail floor interaction. The counter was where Otis stood. The floor was for customers. Otis walked across the floor to where Hazel was standing. He was 61 years old and had a knee that had been reconstructed twice and still gave him trouble in cold weather. He walked without any visible sign of this. He stopped in front of Hazel Cross, and he looked at her forearm for a moment, at the wings, at the numerals, at the line below them. and then he looked at her face. He said, "Brick." Brick was still looking at the tattoo. He looked at Otis. "You put your hand on someone who has served in a ranger unit," Otis said. "In my store." He said it without anger, without theater, with the flatness of a man reading out a fact that carries its own weight and requires no additional pressure. The air in the room changed. It did not change loudly or visibly. It changed the way air changes in a space when something that had been potential becomes actual. A pressure differential, subtle, unmistakable. Brick's mouth opened. "I didn't," he started. "I wasn't trying to." He looked at the tattoo again, at the Roman numerals, at the jump wings, at the 5 words below them. Something was working behind his eyes, something that was not quite recognition, but was the immediate precursor to it. "Ranger Medic," he said, reading it aloud as though the words might mean something different the second time. 18th Airborne Corps, Otis said quietly. 75th Regiment, Combat Medical. He was not speaking to Brick now. He was speaking the information aloud the way you speak it when you are confirming something to yourself. He turned to Hazel. "Iraq," he said. It was not a guess. It was a starting point. Hazel's expression had not changed. The tattoo was visible on her forearm. She did not pull her sleeve down. "And after," she said. "Afghanistan," Caleb Reed said from the back counter. He was looking at his phone, at the screen, where he had been running a search for the past 10 minutes and had, in the last 30 seconds, found something. He was looking at what he had found with an expression that Ethan Koss, who was watching from the backroom doorway, would later describe as the face of a man who has just opened a book expecting one story and found a completely different one inside. Caleb set the phone face down on the counter. He looked at Hazel. "You need to know," he said, "that I had no idea." "Most people don't," she said. "That's the point." Otis looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to Brick. Not to confront, not to perform, simply to close a chapter. "I'm going to ask you to leave the store," Otis said. "You and Flynn. Today." It was the calmest eviction in the history of evictions. No raised voice, no ultimatum, no drama, just a statement from a man who owned the room and had decided who was and was not welcome in it. Brick's jaw worked. He looked at Flynn. Flynn was looking at the floor. "This is," Brick started. "I know you'll come back another day," Otis said. "And when you do, we'll start fresh. But today is done." Crystal Vance was still on the retail floor. She had not moved during Otis's walk from behind the counter. She had watched it, had watched the tattoo, had watched Otis, had watched Brick's face, had watched Caleb Reed remove his cap, and she was still processing. Crystal was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had organized her understanding of the world around a set of social hierarchies that were real and functional and had served her well for a long time. The hierarchy she had arrived with into Webb's tactical supply and range this afternoon had placed Hazel Cross in scrubs, with Crocs, with a canvas bag and a badge from a regional hospital, at a particular position in that hierarchy, and everything that happened subsequently had been in service of maintaining that placement. What she was confronting now was the discovery that the hierarchy had been wrong, not adjusted, wrong. That the position she had assigned was not merely lower than Hazel's actual position, but located on a completely different map. She was not, at her core, a malicious person. She was a person who had been careless with assumptions and was now holding the consequences of that carelessness in both hands and finding them heavier than expected. She looked at Hazel Cross standing in the middle of the retail floor, with a tattoo visible on her forearm and a store owner standing in front of her with the posture of genuine respect. And Crystal Vance did something that cost her something. She walked over. She stood 2 feet from Hazel. She took her designer sunglasses off the top of her head and held them in both hands. Not as a gesture, not for show, just because she needed something to do with her hands. The catalog she had been carrying all afternoon was on the bench behind her, forgotten. The phone was in her pocket. All the props of her afternoon, the catalog, the phone, the studied disengagement, had been put down, and she was just standing there, which was a different thing. "I owe you an apology," she said. She said it plainly, not elaborately, not with the codicils and qualifications that apologies sometimes get when the person offering them needs the apology to do less work than a real one would. "I made assumptions about you, and I used them to make today harder than it needed to be. I'm sorry." She paused, and then added the thing she hadn't planned to add. "My father served. He never talked about it either." Something in the room shifted. not dramatically, but the way rooms shift when a person says a true thing they hadn't intended to say. Hazel looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Just that. No absolution beyond the acknowledgment, and no diminishment of the acknowledgment either. It was received, and that was real, and that was enough. Crystal nodded. She looked as though she wanted to say more, and had correctly identified that more was not required here. She stepped back. Her shoulders were slightly lower than they had been all afternoon. Daisy Monroe, who had been watching this from her position near the bench, looked briefly at the ceiling and then back at her own hands. She was the wife of a deployed soldier. She had been in rooms like this her whole adult life. Rooms where men assessed other people's right to be there, where the criteria shifted depending on who was doing the assessing, where the women who moved through those rooms carrying the heaviest things were also the ones most likely to be told they were in the wrong place. She pressed her lips together and said nothing, which was the loudest thing she did all afternoon. Brick and Flynn left. The electronic chime above the door sounded once as they went, the same flat institutional beep that had announced Hazel's arrival. And then the door closed, and they were gone, and the store returned to the business of being a store. It did not return easily or quickly. There was a period of several minutes in which everyone on the retail floor moved through the resumption of normal activity with the slightly effortful quality of people trying to remember what normal looks like. Garnet went back to the counter and began actually organizing the shelf he had been pretending to organize. Ethan emerged from the back room and resumed the parts order. The man in the far lane finished his string of fire and came out through the range bay door, glancing at the room with the mild curiosity geek of someone who can sense they missed something but can't determine what. Caleb Reed was at the back counter. He had turned his phone face up again. He was looking at the screen with the expression of a man who has continued reading and found that the book is longer than he expected, and that the additional pages are significant. He looked up and found Otis at the counter. "You see what I'm looking at," Caleb said. Otis looked at the phone from where he stood, at the search result Caleb had pulled up. It was a service record summary, the publicly available kind, partial, the kind that shows unit affiliations and deployment rotations, but not classified operational details. It showed 3 deployment rotations: Iraq, 2007, Afghanistan, 2010 to 2011, Syria, 2014. It showed 2 award citations. The text of the citations was redacted, standard for classified operations, but the awards themselves were listed by name: Silver Star, Purple Heart, Purple Heart. Otis Webb looked at the screen for a long time. 2 Purple Hearts, Caleb said. "I see them," Otis said. "Syria, 2014. Caleb paused. "That's when she got out." A small silence. "People come home from Syria in 2014 a different way than they went," Otis said. Caleb looked at the range bays. Through the glass partition, in lane 6, the carrier was moving. Hazel bringing the target in, checking it, moving it back out. "She's a nurse now," Caleb said. It was not a diminishment. It was an observation, the kind that contains more respect in its plainness than any elaboration could add. A Ranger combat medic does not become a civilian ICU nurse because they have lost interest in keeping people alive. They become one because the work continues and they cannot stop doing it, and the address has changed, but the essential commitment has not. "Yeah," Otis said. He reached under the counter. He found what he was looking for in the 3rd drawer, a coin, brass, worn smooth from handling. One side showed the Delta Force crest, detailed and exact, the stylized arrowhead and lightning bolt. The other side read, Mogadishu, 1993, Task Force Ranger. It was the kind of coin that circulates only through specific hands, that serves as a credential and a memory and a claim of belonging all at once. He set it on the counter, he looked at it for a moment, then picked it up and carried it toward the range bays. Hazel was running her 3rd group when she heard the glass door open behind her. She finished the string of 5, 2 shots, reset, 2 shots, reset, 1, before she lowered the P2 to yes and turned. Otis was standing at the entrance to lane 6. He was not wearing hearing protection, which meant he had not planned to stay long. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he held out the coin. She looked at it. The Delta Force crest on the face she could see. She took it, turned it over. Mogadishu, 1993. She was quiet for a moment. "I knew someone who was there," she said. "Most people in our business did," Otis said. "He didn't come back." A pause. A lot of them didn't, Otis said. That's why the ones who did still carry those. She held the coin in her palm for a moment longer, feeling the weight of it, the specific gravity of something that has been handled by hands that understood exactly what it meant. And then she placed it back in his hand, gently, the way you return something valuable that belongs to someone else. Yours, she said. He looked at the coin in his hand. He closed his fingers around it. Lane 6 is yours as long as you want it, he said. No charge today. She looked at him. I'll pay for the lane, she said. He almost smiled. It was a very small almost smile, the kind that functions as fluent communication between two people who both understand the principle being expressed. She would pay for what she used because she did not want a debt, even a gracious one. He understood this precisely. Fair enough, he said. He turned and walked back out through the glass door. She raised the P226. She fired. Bibble. Garnet Holt was behind the counter when Otis came back to the retail floor. He had been watching the door to the range bays all afternoon, in the way of someone who has made a series of choices they are currently reassessing. He had been assessing them more rapidly in the last 20 minutes. Otis went behind the counter, placed the coin back in the third drawer, and looked at his employee. Garnet opened his mouth. He was 23 years old and not entirely without conscience, and what his conscience was currently generating was a version of an explanation that began with, "I was just," and ended with something that placed the decisions he had made this afternoon in a context that made them reasonable. "I don't need to hear it," Otis said. "I need you to understand what happened today." "I know what happened," Garnet said. "I handled it wrong." "You handled a customer the way Brick wanted you to handle her," Otis said, "which means Brick was running this counter for about an hour. That doesn't happen again." "It won't." "I know it won't," Otis paused. "Go home at close. Don't come in Monday. Come back Tuesday. Start over." Garnet looked at the counter. "Yes, sir," he said. It was the first time he had called Otis sir in 2 years of employment. Otis did not comment on it. He turned to the shelf behind the counter, selected a box of 9mm cleaning patches, and began putting them back in alphabetical order by caliber. The store settled into its ordinary sounds. The next person to approach the range bay door was Noah Holt. Her instructor Gerald had been delayed by a phone call outside, which left her briefly without supervision and with the decision about what to do with that gap. She was 16 and had come here today because she wanted to learn to shoot and because her older brother worked here and had promised her the basics. The afternoon had not gone the way she expected. She pushed through the glass door. The range smelled different from the retail floor, sharper, more enclosed, with the layered residue of all the rounds that had ever been fired in this space compressed into the walls and ceiling. She walked past lanes 1 through 5. Lane 6 was at the far end. She stopped at the partition glass. Hazel Cross was at the firing line, target at 25 yards. The P226 raised in a two-handed grip, elbows slightly bent, shoulders level. She was firing in pairs. 2 shots, a breath, 2 shots. And the precision of it was different from what Noah had seen in movies or in online videos. There was nothing performative about it, no stance adopted for effect. Just a person and a tool and a distance and the absolute economy of someone doing something they have done so many times that the self-consciousness has long since burned away. Noah watched for 3 minutes. Then Hazel brought the target carrier in, pulled the target, and noticed the girl standing at the glass. She didn't startle. She turned with the calm of someone who was aware of the presence before the presence announced itself, and she looked at Noah through the partition for a moment. She gestured toward the door with her head. Noah pushed through. The range noise was louder without the glass between them. Noah stopped a few feet inside the lane. She was not sure of the protocol here. She had a beginner's relationship with the space and all its rules, written and unwritten. "You're Garnet's sister," Hazel said. "Yeah," Noah paused. "I'm sorry. About..." "Not your responsibility," Hazel said. She folded the target and placed it in her bag. "You came for a lesson?" "First one." Hazel looked at her for a moment. "How old are you?" 16. "When Gerald's ready, pay attention to the reset." She held the P226 at an angle so Noah could see the trigger mechanism without looking down the muzzle. Most beginners focus on the pull. The reset is where the control actually lives. Feel where the trigger stops, then let it forward only as far as it needs to go. She paused. "You'll know when you find it." Noah looked at the gun, then at Hazel. She had about 400 questions, and the sense that this was not the time for most of them. She chose one. "Did you always want to be a nurse?" she asked. Hazel considered this. "I always wanted to keep people alive," she said. "The method changes." Noah nodded. It was an answer that would settle into her and expand over the next several years into something that shaped the kind of person she decided to become. She didn't know this yet. She was 16 and standing in a gun range and receiving, without having asked for it, the beginning of a philosophy. "You should go back out," Hazel said. "Your instructor's probably looking for you." "Yeah." Noah started for the door, then turned. "For what it's worth, what happened out there? You were—" She stopped. The available words were insufficient. "You didn't need to prove anything, but you did anyway. That was something." Hazel looked at her. "Go learn your reset," she said. Noah went. Caleb Reed was still at the back counter when Hazel came out of the range bays for the last time. He had been there for the better part of an hour, and Otis had not hurried him along, and they had been talking, quietly, the way men who share a certain kind of professional background talk, which is mostly not talking but existing in the same space in a way that communicates things that talking would only approximate. Hazel came through the glass door. She had her canvas bag, her used targets folded inside. The P226 was back in its concealed holster, and inside the waistband position on her left side, under the untucked hem of the scrub's top, that no one in the retail store had known was there all afternoon. Ivy Collins was still in the store. She had stayed. She had not followed Hazel into the range bays. She had found a seat near the entrance, and she had sat with her bag in her lap for the better part of an hour, and she had been trying to put together a conversation that she now suspected did not exist. There was no version of, "Why didn't you tell me that was fair to ask?" There was no version of, "I didn't know that was adequate to say." She had worked alongside this woman through a code call at 2 in the morning when a 19-year-old soldier came in from Fort Caldwell with a traumatic brain injury, and Hazel had managed that room with a clarity and speed that Ivy had attributed afterward to natural talent. She understood now that it was not natural talent. It was something that had been forged in conditions she had no frame of reference for, carried home in the body, and applied, without announcement, every day in a regional ICU in a small Virginia town. Hazel stopped at the sight of her. "You stayed," Hazel said. "I was going to go," Ivy said. "And then I wasn't." A pause. "You can ask," Hazel said. "I don't know what to ask." Ivy looked at her colleague, at the scrubs, the bag, the person she thought she'd known, and made a small, helpless gesture. "I don't even know where to start." "Start at the beginning when you're ready," Hazel said. "But not today." Ivy laughed, a short, startled exhale that was more relief than humor. "Okay." She stood up. "Okay, yeah." She pulled her bag onto her shoulder and stood beside Hazel in the way of someone who is recalibrating a friendship from its foundation and finding that the foundation is still there, just larger than expected. They walked toward the exit together. She stopped at the main counter to settle the lane fee. Garnet, with a stiffness that was the physical posture of a young man attempting accountability, set the rate, and she paid it. And he did not meet her eyes fully, and she did not require him to. Caleb came off the back counter and walked over. "I don't want to intrude," he said, "but I want you to know if you ever need anything at Fort Caldwell, anything at all." He produced a card from his shirt pocket and held it out. It had his name and his SFC designation and a direct line. "Doesn't matter what." She took it, looked at it, put it in the canvas bag. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "Caleb." She almost smiled. It was approximately as much of a smile as Otis's almost smile had been. Functional, complete, carrying what it needed to carry without excess. "Caleb," she said. She turned toward the exit. Silas Grant was near the door. He had been there for a few minutes, coat on, apparently about to leave himself. He was 83 years of age and walked with a cane he treated as an accessory rather than a necessity, using it to point at things and indicate opinions rather than to actually balance. He had been in this store every Friday afternoon for 11 years, and Otis Webb had never once asked him why, and Silas had never explained. The company was its own reason. He stopped in front of Hazel. He was a man of considerable height even now, and he looked at her the way old soldiers look at young ones, not as though they are lesser, but as though they carry something the old soldier once carried and recognizes. "You served well," he said. 3 words, the right 3 words. Hazel stopped. She looked at him. at the age in his face, at the evidence of decades of a life organized around certain principles: service, loyalty, the idea that some things are worth more than comfort. She looked at the cane and the coat and the folded reading material tucked under his arm. "Thank you, sir," she said. The "sir" was not reflex. It was deliberate. Silas nodded once. The nod of a man who has received something he was owed and is giving back something in return. He touched the brim of his cap, a ghost of a salute, the kind that lives in the body after the body has no occasion for it, and stepped aside. She pushed through the door. The electronic chime sounded once. Disaster. The parking lot of Webb's Tactical Supply and Range held the particular amber quality of late afternoon light that belongs to the hours between end of work and evening. The light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, or perhaps exactly as significant as it is. Hazel stood on the sidewalk outside the door for a moment. She readjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder. The targets inside it had grouped at under an inch at 25 yards. The ammunition she had come here for was in the bag. She had paid for both the ammunition and the lane. The transaction that had been obstructed for the better part of an hour had been completed. She started toward her car, a 10-year-old Civic in navy blue, parked at the far end of the lot because she had arrived expecting lanes to be open and parking to be sparse, and had been wrong about neither of those things. Inside the store, through the glass front window, Logan Pruitt was reviewing what he had on his phone. He had been reviewing it since Hazel left the range bays, and he had already made 3 decisions. First, that it was going on the Harlow Creek community page. Second, that he was going to title it something that let the footage speak for itself. Third, that he was not going to name the woman in it because naming her wasn't the point. The footage was the point. The point was visible. In 11 seconds of a woman disassembling a handgun on a gun store counter, and in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, the reveal of a tattoo, and in the way a 61-year-old store owner walked across his own retail floor with the bearing of a man greeting someone who had earned the greeting. Inside the store, Archer Blaine had been on his phone for the past 15 minutes. He was a reporter for the Harlow Creek Gazette, which covered a town of 12,000 people with the diligence of a paper covering a much larger city. Because Archer believed that small places contained large stories and had spent 20 years proving himself right. He had arrived at Webb's at 17:15 hours to pick up a box of cleaning patches. He had stayed for something entirely different. He called his editor. "I need some space on the front page," he said. "How much space?" "However much the front page has." A pause on the line. "What's the story?" his editor asked. "I don't have the name yet," Archer said. "But the story is..." He paused, looking through the window at the parking lot, at the Navy Civic, at the small figure of a woman adjusting a canvas bag on her shoulder. "The story is about who we don't see when we're looking." The editor was quiet for a moment. "Send it tonight," she said. "I'll move the county zoning piece." Hazel had reached the door of the Civic. She put her hand on the handle. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. Raymond Cross, brother. She looked at it for 2 full seconds. Raymond Cross was in Norfolk, Virginia. He was 41 years old, a retired Marine, currently doing contract work for a private logistics firm that was, depending on how much you read the fine print, something other than a logistics firm. He called her on her birthday, at Christmas, occasionally in the middle of the night, when something that had happened 20 years ago found its way to the surface in the way things do in the early hours. He did not call her on Friday afternoons. She answered. "Ray," she said. "Hey." His voice was careful, the particular careful that comes when someone has information and is deciding how to deliver it. "You somewhere you can talk?" "Parking lot, gun store." A brief pause. "Of course you are." A shorter pause. "You okay?" "Always." "Listen." He shifted on his end. She heard the sound of a chair, of someone turning away from other people in a room. "I got a call this afternoon, from someone I haven't heard from in a while." "Who?" "Caleb Reed." She was still, her hand on the door handle, the amber light making long shadows across the parking lot. "He called you," she said, "about an hour ago. He said he saw your forearm and ran your record." Raymond paused. "He said your public file stops at 2014, that the Syria rotation is listed as completed, and then there's nothing. No discharge date, no separation documentation, no post-service address." He paused again. "He said it looks like someone redacted a section and then closed the file without replacing what they took out." She had not been aware that Caleb had gotten that far into the record. She processed this without showing it to anyone because there was no one to show it to. She was alone in a parking lot in Harlow Creek, Virginia, with one hand on a car door. "He's not wrong," she said. "Hazel." There was something in Raymond's voice, a tightness that was not his usual register. "He's not the only one who's been looking. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't have anything solid until today." She waited. "Someone from the unit above yours has been running searches for the last 8 months, Raymond said. "Not through official channels, through back-channel routes, the kind you use when you don't want a request showing up on a server log. Someone with high clearance and a reason to stay off the formal record." She thought about this. "What do they want?" "They want you specifically," Raymond said. "There's a file with your name on it that I didn't know existed until today. Caleb found it by accident. He was cross-referencing the Syria rotation to find out if any of your unit made it onto the casualty rolls. And he found a secondary file tied to your service number. It's classified above my clearance level. He shouldn't have been able to see it either, but someone made an error when they digitized it, and it's been sitting there." Raymond's voice dropped. "Hazel, someone survived." She closed her eyes. She had been carrying this for 4 years. The specific, unresolvable weight of what happened in a valley in Syria in late 2014. A valley whose name she did not say aloud, whose coordinates she held in her body, the way the body holds certain coordinates that are not coordinates to places, but coordinates to moments that restructured everything. She had been the last one out. She had made the decision she had made, under the conditions that existed, with the information she had at the time, and she had been required to believe, because the alternative was not survivable as a continuous daily experience, that she had done everything that could have been done. Someone survived. She opened her eyes. The parking lot, the amber light, a minivan pulling in, 2 men loading a range bag into a truck, the front window of Webb's, through which she could see Noah Holt taking her first real steps down a lane with her instructor. "How long?" Hazel said. "Long," Raymond said. "That's all I know. The file says they made contact with a U.S. asset 8 months ago who confirmed the identification." 8 months, she said. The number settled into her. Someone had been waiting, or surviving, for 4 years, and the knowledge of it had been moving toward her for 8 months, and it had arrived on a Friday afternoon in a gun store parking lot in Harlow Creek while she was wearing scrubs and holding a canvas bag full of folded targets. "They need a medic," she said. "They need you," Raymond said. "Not just any medic, you. The file says—" He stopped. "It says you're the only person who knows the full context of what happened in that valley. Anyone else who goes in is working with partial information." She looked at her left forearm. The sleeve was down again, the tattoo invisible. "Ranger Medic, de oppresso liber." 4 years ago, she had come home and built a life in which she used the same skills at a different address, in a different uniform, under a different set of circumstances, and she had been good at it, and it had been real, and it had mattered in the way that saving lives always matters, regardless of the theater. She had not been waiting for this call. She had also not been pretending it wasn't possible. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes, she said. "Hazel, 10 minutes, Ray." She ended the call. She stood in the parking lot with the phone in her hand, and the late light falling across her scrubs and the canvas bag on her shoulder, with the folded targets inside, and 2 boxes of Federal HST 9mm, 124 grain, purchased after an hour of being told she was not the kind of person who should have them. She looked at the entrance to Webb's Tactical Supply and Range. Through the glass front window, she could see the retail floor. Garnet at the counter, Silas's empty chair near the window, the lane reservation board with her name still written on lane 6 in blue marker. Noah Holt visible at the far edge of the floor, listening to her instructor with the focused attention of someone hearing something they intend to remember. She looked at her forearm one more time. Then she pulled her sleeve down, got in the car, and drove north. Not toward home, toward Fort Caldwell. The 10 minutes began. Inside the store, the Friday afternoon settled toward its close. Otis Webb locked the front door at 1800 hours, as always. He ran the till, as always. He cleaned the demonstration weapons and returned them to their cases, as always. He did all of this with the methodical competence of a man who has organized his life around routine, because he knows what happens in the absence of it. He had opened this store 11 years ago, after 2 years of private sector work that had no satisfying name. He had come back to Harlow Creek because it was 2 miles from Fort Caldwell, and proximity to the community was the only thing that made the silence of civilian life manageable. He did not talk about Mogadishu to his customers, and he did not talk about Delta Force, and he did not talk about the men who had carried him 200 meters under fire in October of '93. He had never needed to. The work spoke what it needed to speak, and the rest stayed where it belonged. What he had seen today was the same principle operating in a different person, a generation later, with a different set of coordinates and a different set of costs. A woman who had come in to buy 2 boxes of ammunition and a lane, and had received, instead of those things, an extended lesson in other people's assumptions about who she was, who had responded to this not by correcting the assumptions, but by simply being who she was until the room had no choice but to adjust. He had walked across his own floor to stand in front of her because it was the right thing to do, and because he had been taught by people who no longer lived that the right thing always has a cost, and the cost is always worth paying. When he was done closing, he sat on the stool behind the counter in the quiet of the closed store and took the challenge coin from the 3rd drawer. He held it the way he always held it, feeling the weight, the worn edge, the texture of the crest on its face. He had carried this coin for 32 years. He had taken it out and held it more times than he could count. Not to remember Mogadishu exactly, because Mogadishu was not the kind of thing that required a physical prompt to remember. He took it out because it was the one object in his life that functioned as pure evidence. Evidence that certain things had happened, that certain people had existed, that certain costs had been paid and would not be forgotten. Today, for the first time in a long time, the coin felt connected to something present rather than something past. He put it back in the drawer. He turned off the lights. He drove home through Harlow Creek in the last of the evening light, past the regional hospital 2 miles north, past the entrance to Fort Caldwell, another 2 miles beyond that, past all the ordinary architecture of a small town that contained, in its population of 12,000 people, an unknown number of individuals carrying histories that would not fit in a service record summary and would never be found by anyone who wasn't looking with the right eyes. So the story of what happened that Friday afternoon at Webb's Tactical Supply and Range reached the internet by 2100 hours that evening in the form of a 43-second video that Logan Pruitt posted to the Harlow Creek community page with the caption, "This happened today at Webb's Tactical. Watch to the end." The video showed, in sequence, a woman in hospital scrubs standing at a gun store counter, a pistol placed in front of her, her hands, moving with the kind of efficiency that requires no commentary, the parts of the pistol arranged in a line in 11 seconds. The moment of silence. It cut at that point. Logan had stopped the recording before the sleeve, before the tattoo, before Otis's walk across the floor. He had made this choice deliberately because what the video showed was already the story, and the rest of it belonged to the people who were there. By midnight, the post had 400 shares. By the following morning, it had crossed 40,000. The comments were various. Some were the expected noise of the internet, people projecting, debating, inserting their opinions about what it meant. But the ones that accumulated most consistently were from people who recognized something specific in the video, veterans who had watched those hands move and identified the sequence, medical professionals who had worked alongside combat medics and knew the particular economy of someone trained to assess a situation and respond to it without wasted motion, spouses of service members who watched the video and then watched it again and then called their husbands or wives to watch it and did not say anything after because there was nothing adequate to say. One comment, from an account with no profile picture and 2 years of posting history, read, "There are people like this in every room you've ever been in. You just didn't know how to look." It received more likes than any other comment on the post. Archer Blaine submitted his piece at 22:30 hours. His editor ran it the following Tuesday on the front page of the Harlow Creek Gazette, under the headline, "The Quiet Ones." She had changed his title. He thought hers was better. The piece did not name Hazel Cross. It described in specific and careful prose what Archer had witnessed in Webb's Tactical Supply and Range on a Friday afternoon. A woman who was told in a dozen ways, some subtle and some not, that she did not belong in a space, and who responded to this not with anger or with performance or with the public assertion of her credentials, but with the same wordless competence she had spent years developing in conditions that made a gun store on a Friday afternoon look very, very simple. The piece ended with a paragraph that Archer had written and rewritten 4 times before settling on a version that he felt was accurate. Every town has them. The people who have paid the highest prices in the quietest ways, who come home to ordinary lives and ordinary jobs and ordinary afternoons, and who carry with them, under the ordinary surface of things, a weight that most of us will never be asked to carry. We don't see them because we don't know how to look. We don't know how to look because nobody taught us, but they're there. They are in every room you have ever been in. They are your nurses and your mechanics and your store clerks and your neighbors. They are the person ahead of you in line at the grocery store. They are the one sitting in the corner of the coffee shop. And sometimes, if you pay close enough attention, you can almost see it. The particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has been in the kind of quiet that has a different name. The piece was shared 14,000 times in the first 48 hours. The Harlow Creek Gazette had never had a piece shared 14,000 times. Sorry. Garnet Holt came back on Tuesday. He arrived 20 minutes before opening, which was not his usual habit. He let himself in with his key and he cleaned the counter, really cleaned it, the kind of thorough work that takes time. And when Ethan arrived and then Otis arrived, he was already behind the counter, organized and early, and quiet in the particular way of someone who has done their thinking and arrived at the other side of it. He didn't say anything about Friday. He didn't offer more explanations. He did his job. At lunchtime, Noah Holt came in with her instructor Gerald for her second session. She stopped at the counter and looked at her brother. "You know what she told me?" Noah said. Garnet looked at her. "About the trigger," Noah said. "The reset." He waited. "She said most people focus on the pull, but control lives in the reset." Noah paused. "I think she was talking about more than shooting." Garnet was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think she was." Noah went toward the range bays. Garnet watched her go. He turned back to the counter and did his job. The reservation on Lane 6 remained in Hazel's name on the whiteboard until Otis erased the board at closing on Sunday. He left hers until last. When he finally erased it, he looked at the blank space for a moment. Then he wrote, in the lower right corner of the board, in letters too small for customers to read from the retail floor, 5 words: HST, 45 Lane, caliber standing. It was the store's informal honor roll, the names and notes of people who had used the lanes and left something behind. Most entries were caliber records, competition scores, the occasional notation about a group size that warranted remembering: Hazel Cross, RN, Ranger Medic, 18th Airborne, 75th Regiment, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts. Her entry was HST, 45 Lane, caliber standing. It meant she came here, she paid for her lane, she shot the way people shoot when they are maintaining something real, and she left without asking for anything she hadn't earned. Otis capped the marker. He turned off the lights. Outside, Harlow Creek was doing what small towns do in the quiet hours, settling into itself, running at the low frequency of ordinary life, containing within its 12,000 people all the accumulated weight of who they were and what they had been and what they were still, in various degrees and with varying visibility, continuing to be. 2 miles north, the regional hospital's ICU ward ran its overnight shift. 2 miles further, Fort Caldwell ran its own. And somewhere between the two, on the road that connects them, in a Navy Civic moving north through the amber evening, a woman with a canvas bag and a healed forearm and a phone in her pocket that held a number she had not yet called back was doing the thing that defines the people who survive, the kind of experiences she had survived. She was deciding what to do next. The 10 minutes she had asked for were long past. She knew it. She drove. Real strength doesn't ask for a room. It just takes one.